She speaks nationally about the influences that impact popular and consumer culture, and in her spare time, she enjoys attending fashion shows, traveling, and discovering new music. And did I mention that she is a 2012 graduate of our master's degree program in integrated marketing communications? Yes, she is one of our own, and we're proud to claim her. Let's give a warm welcome for Leyda Hernández.
Thank you. All right, so let's get started. So thank you so much for welcoming me here. So this is actually my first time here in Morgantown. So even though I am a graduate of the Integrated Marketing Communications program, this is actually my first time here at the university. And so I was actually mentioning that my entire relationship with West Virginia has actually been facilitated by technology. So it's a little bit ironic in terms of me being here physically to talk about the evolution of luxury and how technology has played a role within it. And so I want to kind of start with the evolution of luxury. I want to start with why luxury is kind of a completely different space when it comes to marketing and communications. It's unlike any other category. So when you think about the luxury world, you really kind of have to focus on these major milestones. So when we look at the luxury space, it really, in retrospect, it sets a history for us in terms of what are the most valuable things for a society, what kind of moments do we celebrate, what kind of elements, materials do we consider valuable, and it really kind of sets a stone from a historical perspective in terms of different kinds of milestones. And so luxury is very, very different from any other category. And the reason for that is because you have to manage this illusion of exclusivity. Luxury, by its very nature, is premium. It's something that you aspire to. It's that thing for special moments. It's something that's scarce, something that's extremely valuable. And so when we think about the luxury space, we really kind of have to manage this illusion of exclusivity in everything that you do. You have to protect the brand, and so that you don't lose any control of it, and then it ends up in the hands of somebody else, and ends up in the hands of the marketplace in a way that you didn't intend for the brand to actually appear. And so you really kind of have to manage a brand very, very differently in the luxury space than if you have a same brand in the same category, but that's not luxury. And so you have to think of luxury from the perspective of how does it influence culture. When you would typically do marketing, you figure out who your target consumer is, and you know that this is an 18 to 24-year-old female. She lives in New York City. She is college educated. She makes around $75,000. She goes to yoga on Sundays. She lives in Brooklyn, right? And so there's all of these different elements that put together the face of our consumer. And traditionally, in marketing, you would find who your consumer is, and you would target that person specifically. In the luxury space, you never do that. Never. It shatters this illusion of exclusivity, this illusion of this being something that you have to, that's almost unattainable, and that makes it that much more special and important. And so if you can't go directly to the consumer, what do? What you have to do is you actually have to affect culture. And so instead of going straight to your consumer, what you have to do is you incorporate luxury. You incorporate the brand into history. You incorporate the brand into music. You incorporate the brand into art. And then us as consumers and as ambassadors of culture and consumers of culture, then we end up becoming aware of the brand. And so, and I'll give you a very good example that we'll kind of touch on later in the presentation. But Versace, for example, has, for the last few years, Bruno Mars has been wearing Versace head to toe. You will never actually see an advertisement for Versace to any of us in this room. But you see Versace constantly, over and over again, because you see people wearing it over and over again. And so you're not exposed to the brand directly, you're exposed to a musician who embodies that message of that brand. And so it's an art of storytelling. And so what I want to do is I want to actually start with the past. So what did luxury look like in the 80s and the 90s? Where is it at today? And then where does it need to go in the future in order to remain competitive? And not a lot of luxury brands have done this. So luxury brands come and go. Even though the nature of a luxury brand is that it's timeless, it's classic, that we want this to become legendary. The whole point is to form a legacy. Not all luxury brands live long enough to do this. Fashion houses come and go, and they might have their time in the time of the spotlight for a few decades or even for a few centuries. But if they don't constantly evolve the same way that you have to do with any other business, they die out in the same way if they lose their relevancy in the marketplace. And so I wanted to kind of tell you guys a story about a brand that I feel is very close to me because it has, oh, was that me? There we go. Okay, no, it's totally fine. Okay, so I wanted to tell you guys the story of a brand that has very strong ties to the city that I grew up in. So I live in New York City now, and I've lived there for a few years, but I actually grew up in Miami. And so I wanted to kind of take you through the evolution of this particular brand, the past, the present, and the future of this brand. So this is a fine leather goods and ready-to-wear brand, an Italian brand that started in the 70s. By the time that the 90s came around, this was the height of the brand's success. And so they essentially, during that decade, created the look of that decade. And so they were part of everything. They were part of music. They were part of Hollywood scene. They were part of the modeling world. They were in films. They were everywhere. And so it's one of the few brands that was actually completely independent and continues to be. And so they control every single aspect from design to distribution, which is very rare in the luxury world. And so at this time, this is the height of their success in the 90s. And they were infamous for kind of bringing sex into the world of high fashion. However, in 1997, in the midst of its popularity, its founder and its creator was murdered. And so this shocked not only the business, but this also shocked the entire industry. And so this is the story of Versace. So then it becomes, who is this brand? What is the brand? What does it stand for? If the man that created it and managed everything from design all the way to distribution is no longer with us. And so in the 90s, it created this look. It was worn from everybody from Elton John, Michael Jackson, Elizabeth Hurley, and this is the dress, that dress that was coined, this black Versace dress that she wore. And they were infamous, they were everywhere. However, as time went on, they started to lose their relevancy. They were so tied to this 90s era that a lot of the clothing, a lot of the style, all of a sudden was dated to that particular time period. And they almost became synonymous with tackiness, something that you never want to represent or embody as a luxury brand. So I want to take you to what they're doing today, because the world of today is very, very different than the world of the 90s. We were just coming out with beepers at that time, and so now we have a whole different world ahead of us in terms of smartphones, in terms of Facebook, this level of connectivity. And even next, when we think about the future, we have everything from chatbots to artificial intelligence to virtual reality and how that plays a role. And so as we move away from the 90s and we move away from a lot of these traditional marketing channels that existed and were very, very successful at the time, magazines, if you had editorials wearing Versace clothing and you had features with Versace in Vogue, that was almost all that you had to do. If you had celebrities wear your clothing on the runway and they were photographed, that was almost all that you had to do. And so there was a lot of public relations. There was a lot of editorial in the form of magazines. But as we've kind of moved on to the digital age, we've had to change as well. The luxury space has had to change as well to kind of adapt to that. And the consumer of today, the luxury consumer of today, is inherently a completely different person from the fact that they are younger, they are much more diverse, and they are much more tech savvy. So if you're trying to be a successful luxury brand today, you cannot ignore all the changes that have happened in marketing, because there's almost no way for you to infiltrate culture if you're not part of the marketing channels that bring culture to every single individual here. So the luxury consumer of today. So I wanted to talk about this from a generational perspective. And so at Luxe, we we look at generations a lot because a generation, we typically think of this as a group of people that were born in a certain period of time, and their shared age and their experiences form and shape a distinct worldview. And so whether you are coming from the greatest generation, you're coming from the silent generation, the baby boomer generation, Generation X, Generation Y, which are the millennials, Generation Z, which just started college now, and in the future it'll be Generation Alpha, which will be the children of the millennials. But we like to study generations a lot because that plays a huge role in how you think about the world based on the experience that you had in the decades of your formative years. It shapes how you relate to other people, how you socialize, your norms in terms of etiquette, how you work, your perception of work, how you think about global affairs. So it affects so much of who you are just by the generation that you were born into. And so the luxury consumer of today is very, very focused on the millennial market. So while we still have baby boomers, and they are a huge part of luxury consumption, the millennials are definitely kind of this new player into the space that's not only consuming culture, but they are also shaping the culture at the same time. And so baby boomers were the largest generation up until millennials showed up. And so this is not just a very powerful and a very influential generation, but this is a very large generation. And so some of the things that happened during this time of millennials' developmental years and really shapes how they look at the world and really shapes how they make decisions, how they shop, their relationships, how they socialize, whether they go to college or not. A lot of this is shaped by their experience during the time that they lived. And so we have 9/11 playing a huge role here in terms of being very involved in global affairs very, very early. You also have the Obama election being a milestone in terms from a historical perspective, but because it happened during this decade, this brings a huge wave into a conversation about diversity and race, and revives a conversation that was very prominent during the baby boomer period. You also had the Great Recession that was kind of sparked by the housing market collapse in 2008. And so you had a lot of millennials that not only graduated from college, but could not find a job after they graduated college, had to move back in with their parents, and then that caused a setback of about 5 years in terms of them achieving these kinds of milestones that we think are typical of adults. So moving out on your own, being financially independent, buying your own house, getting married, having children. Millennials are about 5 years behind from the previous generation because of the Great Recession. They entered into a space, they graduated college, entered the workforce, and there was no work. And so a lot of them went back into moving into their parents' homes, but they also saw the experience that their parents had during the same time. So that does not just affect millennials, but their parents as well, all of a sudden were out of work. So these are companies that they worked for 20, 30 years, and all of a sudden they were laid off because of this economic recession. And so it shapes the worldview of millennials in the sense that a lot of them had to create their own jobs. Been very much kind of the rise of the tech industry during that period. Instead of waiting for somebody to give you a job, you created your own. But it also influences how we approach work as employees, because we saw that loyalty in the workplace was not necessarily rewarded when it came to our parents. And so when we saw our parents working for a company 20, 30 years, and during the Great Recession being laid off and entering kind of this, this recession, this economic situation that not only affected us, but definitely affected them as well. All of a sudden, millennials are not very loyal when it comes to the marketplace, when it comes to employees. And so you no longer have this kind of mindset that you're going to start at a company when you graduate college and you're going to stay there for 20 years. That is not a millennial mindset. And there's a reason for that. And so everything that happens, everything that shapes a generation's behavior is affected by either economic reasons, political reasons, social reasons. There's always a larger kind of influence here. You also had the rise of global internet during this time. So this changed not only how we socialize with one another, but this also changed how we educate ourselves. I did an online master's degree, for example. And it changes our relationships. We are no longer dating in person. We are dating online, right? And we have a distinction between the two. We have dating in real life, and we have online dating. And so a lot of people like to think of millennials as digital natives. But in reality, we are not. That's not actually descriptive of our experience. When we were children, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have smartphones. We didn't have tablets. We didn't have any of these things. We were growing up as the internet was growing with it. So technology was growing as we were growing. So we are not actually digital natives. We grew up together. We grew up with digital. And so that inherently changes the experience that we have now as adults. Because a lot of the images that we think of how our life was going to be like as an adult was shaped during a time period when we did not have technology. And so once we get older, and we are immersed, and we are so fluent in digital and technology, it changes the expectation of what we thought adulthood was going to be like, because it doesn't resemble the idea that we had when we were 10 years old and none of this stuff existed. And so we enter the marketplace, for example, we go into the workforce, and then we become adults, and we're like, I'm gonna buy my first house, and then we're like, what do you mean nobody owns a house anymore? And so it inherently changes the experience just because of this influx of technology. It changes how we relate to each other, it changes how we do business, it changes how we educate ourselves. And so there's definitely a culture to this generation. So because we have this kind of dismantlement of a lot of traditional identity institutions, like religion, nationalism, occupation, and gender, and that you use these things to identify who you are and to validate your existence. In this way, we are now kind of broadening. We're no longer kind of classified, putting ourselves in one box. There is so much more to being an American. There is so much more to being a man or a woman. There is so much more to being a teacher, right? You can be several of those things at the same time. And so in terms of how millennials think of themselves, in terms of how they identify, becomes more and more complicated. And so millennials are less likely to marry. They're less likely to take part in religion, less likely to join the military. They are less likely to socialize in person. They value access over ownership. And so instead of buying a car, I just want access to a car by way of Uber, for example. Instead of owning and buying groceries, I just want the food to come to me via Seamless or Grubhub. And so we definitely value accessibility over ownership in terms of our millennial mindset. We're much more likely to identify as LGBT more than any other previous generation. Much more likely to have one-child households or pet child households. Because remember, we are 5 years behind, which means that millennials are having kids at an older age than previous generations. And so because we're having kids older, we're also having less children. We are much more likely to have shorter attention spans and worse short-term memory than previous generations. Like, how many phone numbers can you actually remember, right? I can remember the ones that I learned when I was 10, and I don't remember any other ones ever since then. We're much more likely to be multiracial and ethnically diverse. This is a younger group, much more urban, and even if you don't live in an urban city, you are exposed to that urban lifestyle by way of the screens that you interact with. We have higher disposable incomes than generations before. That also is in part to the fact that we are not having kids or having few kids. And like I said, they are the largest generation after baby boomers. So they just surpassed them in terms of population, and they're currently the largest generation in the American workforce. And the most exciting thing probably when it comes to the luxury world is that this group right here is reaching their peak earning years, which means high disposable income and lots of money. So the luxury market, it's expected to grow by 4 to 5% annually through 2020. And this is huge. It's growing faster, to put this into context, it's growing faster than the US economy, this specific market, which is about 2 to 3% in terms of its growth rate. Millennials are expected to represent 40% of the global personal luxury goods market by 2025. And so if you're thinking about the future of luxury, the future of luxury is millennials. And this is a combination of social influences, political influences, sexual influences, technological influences, economic influences, and many more. Millennials inherently shop differently. So a lot of what being born in one generation and that affecting your behavior, all of these different kinds of events and all of these different kinds of influences, it changes how you eat. It changes how you use transportation. It changes how you educate yourself. It also changes how you shop. You inherently shop differently than any other generation. 60 to 70% of luxury goods sales are now digitally influenced, which means that there is some role over the course of that customer journey, from when that person becomes aware of this brand or product to when they ultimately buy it. There is some element of digital that plays a role there, whether it is video on YouTube, whether it is looking at reviews, whether it is Instagram and checking out who else has the same purse as you, or how they've styled it in a different way. Digital is huge. Digital to store traffic for luxury brands right now is 2 to 1. So their websites are getting more traffic than they are getting in their stores. But that's not to say that stores are not still going to play a role. So online sales by year 2025, they're expected to account for 25% of all sales. Stores are still expected to account for 75% of luxury purchases. And so even though digital is playing a huge role, and even though you almost cannot sell luxury goods anymore without having some kind of digital influence, people are still going into the store to make the actual purchase. And so that store experience, walking into the universe of Versace, walking into the universe of Louis Vuitton, walking into the world of Prada, right? It's like a Disney World for this brand. It's an entire experience. It's this white glove kind of experience, concierge experience, that you're not going to get online. So even though you are researching a ton, exposing yourself to a bunch of content, either from the brand or the product, you are ultimately, 75% at least, is still going into that store to actually make the purchase. If we're looking at not just millennials, but Gen Z, 14% of 18 to 24-year-olds are expected to complete their first luxury purchase online. So that is a huge shift when most luxury brands have almost exclusively avoided the internet as much as possible and for as long as humanly possible. Because it is very, very hard to manage the brand equity, the perception of how valuable a brand is. It's very difficult to have control of that in a medium where everyone has access. So how do you still maintain exclusivity on the internet where anybody can have access to your brand? So the landscape is a completely different space. We've not only disrupted technology, we've not only disrupted transportation, we've not only disrupted the way that we shop, but we've disrupted the world of luxury in terms of production, in terms of distribution, in terms of communications as well. So in today's world, as people get closer and closer and the world gets smaller, you have more brand saturation. And so you have to stand out more. So when data is everywhere and everything is collecting data on you, so if you have Amazon Echo, for example, if you have one of those at home, your Amazon Echo, Alexa, is constantly listening to you. She's always constantly listening for the name Alexa so that she can respond. The same thing with Siri. So every 10 seconds, she's paying attention. If you don't say her name, she destroys the audio file. Then she starts paying attention again, right? But they're constantly listening and collecting data on you. If you have a Nest, for example, in your home, it knows exactly what temperature it is. It knows exactly what day of the week. It knows what the weather is, right? It's connected to your Wi-Fi. So there's a whole lot in terms of data connectivity today. We're still not there in terms of the Internet of Things, but you better believe it's coming. So when data is everywhere, creativity is what becomes king. So you also have the death, so to speak, or the reshaping of department stores and this huge rise of e-commerce. For example, most of us, when we are buying a CPG product, a consumer packaged good product, that we might have gone for buying a pair of sneakers or buying a new bathing suit, whatever it might be. Instead of buying this thing at a store and going into a department store, which their real competitive advantage used to be that you could walk into one place and everything was there, we can now go onto Amazon and everything is there. And so Amazon has really kind of shifted the world in terms of department stores. You had Macy's last year close 20,000 stores just in the US alone. And so Amazon is really kind of focusing on gaining a massive amount of market share. And so it doesn't really care about losing money on an individual purchase. If you bought something that was $5 and it took them and they had to spend $10 to ship it to you, to Amazon, it is still worth it, because that means that Macy's didn't get that purchase. And so eventually, these department stores, for the most part, are dying out. And Amazon wants to be king at the end of the day when that happens. Social media has definitely changed how we shop as well. It's completely disrupted the way that we receive information. If you think about social media, you are no longer kind of discovering and searching for new information. Social media is the internet coming to you. You have these algorithms that are self-serving. They know exactly what you like. They know exactly what you double tap on in terms of Instagram. They know exactly how long you scroll on a specific image. And so when they are putting information into your feed, they're putting information that they already think you are going to like, which means you are kind of creating your own little bubble of things that you already like and receiving information about things that you already like. That makes discovery harder and harder because you are not going out into the world. The world is coming to you based on the things that you already like and enjoy. That makes it very difficult to find things that you don't necessarily like and enjoy, right? You're basically creating your own little bubble. So this forces luxury brands to take a different approach. They have to infiltrate culture. That is what they have to do to be able to reach their consumers and to become relevant again. So Versace was one of the first in terms of e-commerce. So they were one of the first to market in e-commerce, and they launched their e-commerce store in 2012. And that still might seem like they were very late to the game, but when it comes to luxury goods, this is very, very early, actually. For example, Celine. It's a French brand. They do fine leather goods as well. They just launched their e-commerce store for the first time, their first e-commerce website in December. So being first to market in the e-commerce space for Versace, this is absolutely huge. But it's very, very difficult, like I said, to kind of manage the brand perception and this illusion of exclusivity when you have somewhere where everybody can have access. And so more and more, you have this element, this brand, the nature of a brand strategy that is meant to be socially and economically segregationalist, being democratized against the internet users. So with the rise of social media, so we have e-commerce on one side, we have social media on the other side, but these things are all connected. So with social media, we also have the rise of social influence. We also have the rise of social commerce, and we have the rise of social audiences, which is probably the most valuable portion here. So when you think about Facebook, if you have a Facebook, if you have an Instagram, you have Twitter, any of these platforms, you have a LinkedIn, it is free for you to use. If it's free for you to use, then you are not the customer. So you have to think about the business model of each one of these social media platforms. Who is actually the customer? Who is paying the bills for Facebook? Who is paying the bills for Instagram? Who's paying the bills for YouTube? Who's paying the bills for Google? So in reality, these are all media companies that are selling advertising. So each one of the platforms that you interact with is collecting a massive amount of data on you in terms of what you like, what college you went to, where you live, where you work, and because you have it on your phone, it travels everywhere with you as well. And so the platform that you interact with, that's just their tool to collect data on what it is that you're doing, what it is that you're interested in. Then they take that data and that feeds it into their actual product, which is advertising for companies. So all of the ads that you see on Facebook, all the ads that you see on Instagram, that you see on YouTube, have been tailored specifically to you by Facebook's actual customers, which are companies that are trying to reach you. And here we see Versace kind of playing a very heavy role in terms of culture. They see exactly who is popular at that moment, and that is exactly the person that they dress in full head-to-toe Versace, and they definitely document that. And you also see the rise of executives being part of a public public and social face for an organization. So you see that Versace has 11.1 million followers, and Donatella Versace, who's their creative director, has 2.2 million followers. And so it's not just about the brand itself, but it's the people that make up that brand as well. So this is Zayn Malik. So he was in One Direction, and a few years ago kind of went off as a solo artist. And I showcase this because I think it's important in the sense that social, what it really gives you, like I said, is it collects a massive amount of data on you. It knows who your friends are and what they're interested in. It knows exactly what your social circle looks like. It knows the relationships between one person and another, who you put as private and who you put as public, right? So there's a lot of information that it's collecting in terms of our social relationships and how communities are built, or at least how communities are built in the digital space. And so custom audiences, social media audiences, are huge, and they are massive. So think about that. Versace alone, the brand, had 11.1 million followers. A lot of the time, you don't even get that with a television show. That is huge. That is a massive audience. And so if you don't have the right audience, what you need to do is partner with somebody who does. So if Versace is trying to become relevant among millennials, they choose somebody else who has a massive audience that is a millennial audience to partner with. And so they've partnered with Zayn Malik for this line that they have called Verses. And I want to read you a quote from Donatella Versace, because I think this kind of really, really hones in what Versace is looking for in the strategy behind it. So Donatella says, "I wanted Zayn because he can help me talk to his followers. I want to listen to their language. I want to learn more about them, what they think, and what they like. They are a new generation that without working with someone like Zayn, I will never reach." So for luxury goods and for luxury brands that have become outdated, especially with Versace that was very, very kind of specific to this 90s era and became very dated by it, this is huge for them. This is an opportunity to reach an entirely new market that they would not necessarily reach on their own. You've probably heard this song as well. So this is Bruno Mars, Versace on the Floor. So like I said, they are never going to go directly to the customer. They're going to infiltrate the culture around you to the point where everybody you see is wearing Versace. All the songs that you hear are mentioning Versace. All the films that you see, there are product placements of Versace's products. And so all of a sudden, Versace is in. It's in everywhere. Everywhere you look, they're there. So Bruno Mars has this song, so the title of the song has Versace's name in it. And you also see Donatella Versace kind of optimizing on this same thing. And so she posted a video of herself and a ton of other Versace models lip syncing to the Versace on the Floor song. So if this doesn't come full circle, I don't know what is. And so, nostalgia. Let's kind of shift a little bit away from what the landscape looks like from a digital perspective, and let's talk a little bit about the cultural behavior or the values that surround it. So culture is shaped by a lot of different influences, like I said, social, political, technological, economic. And globalization is an inevitable phenomenon. So on one side, you have consumers that are moving forward with technology. They're moving forward in a new space, a new political era, a new economic era. And you have other consumers that this creates a lot of anxiety for them looking into this kind of very uncertain future from a technology perspective, from an environmental perspective, from a political perspective. And so you have to find solace somewhere. So where do you go? You take a look back. So you look at nostalgia, and on one hand, you have people that are kind of pushing pushing the future forward, whether that's artificial intelligence or anything else. And you have a ton of people that feel a lot of anxiety because of that uncertain kind of future. And so they're looking back. They're looking at a place that they feel comfortable. And so if we think back 3 years ago, the 90s is so in right now. Not just 90s fashion, but 90s everything, like 90s cultural moments. We have shows that were going on in the 90s that we're now bringing back to television. And so we really have kind of lived this nostalgia in a way that's absolutely incredible. You also have what is called the doomsday clock. So you have a bunch of analysts that basically try to calculate the risk that is associated with human development. And they factor a whole lot of things into that. One of that is climate change, is environmental factors. A lot of that is influenced by the availability of nuclear weapons and the propensity of nations to actually use them. And so we think of time kind of as the ultimate luxury, right? And so if you think of, it's like I have this bucket list, I have all these things that I want to do before I die. So my timeline is before death. When you have this kind of like Cold War feel to what is going on globally right now, that brings that clock a little bit shorter. Because you're like, maybe I don't have until I die. Maybe it's like 10, 20 years. And so that kind of anxiety, that kind of haste makes you look back to times that you felt more comfortable. So if you think back 3 years ago, it started with just ripped jeans. All of a sudden, ripped jeans were showing up everywhere, and it was so much more difficult to buy jeans that didn't have holes in it than it was to buy jeans that that were already kind of ripped up. And so if you were a 90s kid, for example, you didn't go and buy your ripped jeans. You ripped the jeans and you kept wearing them. And so now all of a sudden, they were being sold that way, right? So 3 years ago, we started with ripped jeans. Now all of a sudden, we've gone full 90s. We've gone for the whole thing. We've gone all in now. And so you're constantly having these consumers that are going back into years and brands that were relevant to kind of stop this motion and stall this motion and make themselves more comfortable. And so this is a very good example of something that Versace did in their last show, which was for spring 2018. And so it was the 20th year anniversary of a very important moment, which was the death of Gianni Versace. But in the 20th anniversary of Gianni Versace's death, what they did for their spring 2008 collection was that they brought back all of the 90s supermodels to walk the runway. And so this is not just an important moment in fashion, but this is an important moment in culture. This is an important moment in history. And who created that moment? Versace did. And they made sure that it was Instagram friendly. And so you see all the phones that are out. And this is a very good quote, I think, from GQ's style editor. And he says, sometimes you go to a show and the lighting is wrong for an iPhone. And you think, you know what? They shouldn't have had this show at all. And so here is Versace creating history. They're creating a moment in history. And they've made sure that everybody can capture and share this. Many of you have probably heard of this show. It was just released on Fox. But it's the American crime story for the assassination of Gianni Versace. And this is the 20th year anniversary of his death. This is a very important moment in history, in culture, in fashion, in media. And they've made sure to capitalize and send this message out. So all of a sudden, people are talking about Gianni Versace, and maybe, for example, this millennial audience that they're trying to reach, this gives them the opportunity to not just have their story, communicate their story, and let millennials know the story that they might not have been paying attention to 20 years ago. But now they all of a sudden feel much more of a connection with the brand because they know the brand's story. And at the same time, it gives people that lived during this moment the ability to go back and kind of revisit that and have that conversation and that be relevant again. So there's a reason why they did an anniversary issue, an anniversary kind of show about Gianni Versace's death from the perspective of being more relevant as a brand, as the Versace brand, within millennials, but also in the market that lived during that time period. So I wanted to show you this to kind of echo what we've been talking about, that all of these things are really connected. And so what I did was, this is the search trends, and this is all search. So this is image search, this is YouTube search, this is Google search. But it shows the trends of how these things are kind of related. So the red is Bruno Mars, any mentions of Bruno Mars. The yellow is Versace on the floor, and the blue is Versace. And so all of a sudden, if you see the peaks on the yellow, which is Versace on the floor, those same peaks show up for Versace. So whenever there's a search in terms of spike, whenever there's a spike in search for Versace on the floor, there is also a spike in search for Versace. They have done this purposely. And this moment of here, this huge spike in blue, is the premiere date for the Gianni Versace American Crime Story. And so all of a sudden, there's a huge volume of search for Versace that did not exist before that moment. So television affects everything else as well. So all of these media channels are connected, whether it's search, whether it's social, whether it's television, any of it. And so here are some kind of important moments. So June 2017, that's why there's no kind of reference to Versace on the floor before then. That's when Versace on the Floor by Bruno Mars is released. In September 2007, this is when where Donatella Versace chooses to close her show with the 90s supermodels. In November 2007, Bruno Mars performs 24 Magic, fully dressed head to toe in Versace, on CBS. And then January 2008, which is the spike that you see up there, is the assassination of Gianni Versace and the premiere of that show. So there's definitely an art and a science to a luxury strategy. And brands today deserve to have both. They need to have both if they're really going to succeed. And so you can't look at this from the perspective that I'm just going to go out there and influence art, and I'm just going to go out there and influence culture, because you have to know which media channels, what marketing channels transmit culture to your actual audience. And you have to understand that having impeccable materials and impeccable and fascinating craftsmanship is not enough to be a known luxury brand today. You're still going to be a luxury brand if you have impeccable craftsmanship and extraordinary materials. You just won't be a Versace type of brand if that's the only thing that you do. And so how we shop, how we travel, it's all been fundamentally changed by technology. So let's look into a future. And so at Luxe, what we do is we focus on trend forecasting specifically for luxury brands. So we think a lot about this kind of defining the future of luxury. And what does that mean? What influences are going to play a role? What does that look like? Where are the growth opportunities? And where should luxury brands place themselves to be opportunistic in that sense? And so I wanted to talk about just a few of the macro trends that we see kind of going into the future. So one of them is the journey to redefine success. So as we have artificial intelligence introduced in a mass scale in our societies, as we have something like self-driving cars being introduced, it fundamentally changes how we interact and how our societies work. So if you have a car that no longer needs a driver, do you now need a driver's license? Does that become a milestone for teenagers? Probably not. How would you go vote if you don't have a driver's license? That changes the voting experience as well. And here in the US, you have about 3 million truck drivers. It's actually the most common profession here in the US. 3 million truck drivers. And let's say if all of these 14-wheelers, 18-wheelers, if all of these move into self-driving technology, now all of a sudden you have 3 million people that are out of work. And so it fundamentally changes. Technology fundamentally changes how we react to it, how we transport ourselves, but it also changes the economy. If you have 3 million people that are suddenly out of work that now have been reskilled to do something else. And so this completely changes how we define success. If you're a teenager, success might have been that driver's license and getting a car and being able to be independent. Maybe that's no longer the case. Maybe you're independent at a younger age. Maybe the car has absolutely nothing to do with this. If you have this infiltration of information and technology, what does this mean in terms of how you work? If you now have artificial intelligence and you have chatbots doing a percentage of the work that we used to do, or maybe a larger percentage of the work that we used to do, the question is, do we even work anymore? Who knows, right? Does that change retirement if we're no longer working? If we have 3D printing coming into play, do we actually 3D print our houses? So is buying a house a milestone anymore? Should we just buy the land, 3D print the house on top of it, and then when we move, we buy the land somewhere else and move our house? So is buying a house a milestone? What does it mean to be success anymore, to be successful, if none of these things are shaping the way that our societies run? Millennials, for example, like I mentioned, are less likely to get married than previous generations. And probably Gen Z will be fewer than that. So does marriage become a milestone? Is it a milestone anymore? The ultimate luxury is something we have a lot of conversations about and we do a lot of research about. what is going to be defined as luxury in the future? What are the things that are going to be scarce? What are the things that are going to be special? What are the things that are going to celebrate important moments? One of those things is time. Time as a luxury. So, if you are no longer working, right? And maybe not in the same way that you used to do. Maybe 40 hours, we don't necessarily need 40 hours anymore. If time is the ultimate luxury, just at a regular human scale, what does that mean when you are coming into a place where time is arbitrary, where you no longer have these milestones that mark time, where you can pay a premium to get your time back on the things that you don't want to do or the things that you don't enjoy? For example, there's a brand coming out of, it's a e-commerce, I guess, type of company coming out of New York City called LaFleur, which does personal styling and buying for busy female executives. And so instead of you having to spend your time shopping, whether this is something that maybe you don't enjoy it, or maybe you don't have time for it, what this company does is they shop for you, they style your outfits to you, and then every month you get a box at your doorstep with a few different outfits, and you can send back whatever it is that you actually didn't like. So now all of a sudden you're paying a premium to have your time back, because I didn't want to do that thing anyway, right? So have somebody else do that. All of a sudden you're paying a higher premium for craftsmanship more than ever. If we are 3D printing homes, does a home that is made from scratch by somebody that is actually a construction worker, does that make that house more valuable all of a sudden? Cursive, for example, is no longer being taught in elementary schools. It's been replaced with typing. So anybody that can write and read in cursive, is that going to become a luxury for us? Privacy. We've talked so much about technology and about data. All of these things means that the future of in order for our lives to be more and more convenient, this means that they have to collect a massive amount of data to provide that convenience for us. They need to know where we are, they need to know what it is that we're looking for, so that these things come to us in an automated way to make our lives easier, right? So does that mean that we're going to pay a premium for privacy, for people to not share our data or not collect data on us? Is that going to be a luxury good or a luxury service? Nature, for example, is definitely already becoming a luxury. Having that experience to go out in nature. Many of us, this is the first generation that we spend so much more time indoors, to the point that it affects our health in terms of our lack of exposure to sunlight, our lack of exposure to the elements means that we have lower immune systems than past generations. Because we are constantly with our heads down looking at screens, it affects our vision, it affects our posture, right? So going out into nature and having that experience is already becoming a luxury. And with what's going on in terms of climate change, it will become even more so. So a lot of what the future of luxury is going to be is really coming back to the simple things, what we thought as the simple things now, and we might take for granted now. And so we really kind of think about technology, and we think about luxury kind of shaping that. So will a lot of these luxury good companies actually become tech companies? For example, a lot of us are probably maybe familiar with Balmain. They're an old French fashion house, and they've become hugely popular over the last few years, and they've done a lot of work to become relevant in that way. And so what they've done, they had a creative director. They hired a creative director that was in his 20s and that spoke millennial, and they sent him out to the world to build partnerships. And so Balmain did a partnership, a specific collection for H&M a few years ago. They just did a collaboration with, I want to say it was CoverGirl. And so there's Balmain-specific lipsticks that you can buy at CoverGirl's. And so now all of a sudden, the Balmain brand is becoming accessible to a generation that couldn't actually afford haute couture. But now you're buying a Balmain lipstick. So now this is your first step on that relationship with Balmain. Balmain has also entered into the tech space. And so they've partnered with the Hollywood Kim Kardashian game. And you can actually buy virtual outfits, virtual Balmain outfits for your digital avatar. So you are paying for in-app purchases of a virtual dress or a virtual pants or a virtual shirt or shoes that are made by Balmain. So a percentage of the revenue currently comes from mobile technology. And they are an old French fashion house, haute couture fashion house. Well, luxury goods companies focus more on experience. So Tiffany's has already started to do this. Tiffany's, for example, had this huge heyday. If we were looking back at kind of this nostalgia trend. Tiffany's had this huge heyday with breakfast at Tiffany's. However, they've become less and less relevant because they've been attached to a certain kind of customer. And so now that they are trying to go after the millennial consumer, they have done their last campaign with Lady Gaga as the headliner of that campaign, which normally would be completely shocking to most Tiffany's, the traditional Tiffany's customers. They've also focused more on the experience. So in New York City, they have actually opened a cafe so that you can have breakfast at Tiffany's. Whether you are actually buying Tiffany jewelry or not, you can have breakfast at Tiffany's and be part of the brand's experience. Identity crisis is a major trend that we look at. So millennials are kind of stuck between these two worlds. We still see a distinction between our real life selves and our digital selves. We think of dating and we think of online dating. So we're kind of stuck between these two worlds, the traditional world and the new world. Gen Z, the generation right after us. These people are literally digital natives. Online dating is dating. That changes the scope of how they think about things. It changes the scope of how they dress. The conversation about gender fluidity, which is what they're growing up into, changes how they dress and how anybody reacts to if you have a teenager, a male teenager wearing lipstick. They don't think anything of it. It changes the nature of their acceptance when it comes to gender, and it changes their language in terms of digital, because they no longer see a separation between the real world and the digital world. Generation Alpha, which is going to be the children of millennials, this is going to be the wealthiest generation. This is mainly because the birth rate has been so low, so there will only be one person in most families to inherit the amount of wealth that millennials end up gaining. And they will also be the most informed generation ever. And at this point, we'll probably see things like space travel becoming a real reality for them in terms of their vacations. You also see cultural capital as a huge macro trend. And so this is kind of diving into this concept of globalization, but on steroids. And so you have Generation Z, for example, is going to be a larger group of multiracial, multi-ethnic individuals, the largest in history. And so when you get your census form, what box do you check off if you are several of them? So it doesn't just change the reality, the conversations that we have about race or the conversations that we have about skin tone, but it changes how we talk about ourselves when we are several of those things already. You also have emerging markets. You have a lot of, because of the nature of technology, you have a lot of third world countries, for example, that can go straight into another stage of development, into the second world or even into the first world because of technology, because they can skip an entire stage of development. So you have, for example, a lot of countries in Africa. When we normally think of first world countries or developed countries, a lot of the time we think about infrastructure. So do they have technology infrastructure? Do they have communications infrastructure? Traditionally, that meant telephone lines. Do we need telephone lines today? No, not if we don't have landlines. So a lot of African countries can actually go straight into mobile. They don't need telephone lines. They can skip an entire stage of infrastructure development. You also have the possibility of them skipping an entire stage of banking development. So instead of going from cash to credit cards, you can go straight to Venmo. You can transfer money on your mobile device. They can skip an entire stage of development. That changes the conversation of what economies we pay attention to at a global scale and who has a say politically and socially. We are also going to be forcing luxury to be more inclusive. So for example, I went over kind of Bruno Mars and what Versace was doing with him. But you still have, like I said, this element of luxury being segregationalist. And this doesn't just happen from the perspective of who they choose to partner with or what audiences they go after or what channels they expose themselves to, but it also plays a role in terms of the nature of who makes up, who do they project as a Versace model? Or who do they project? Who do they choose for these kinds of partnerships? For example, there's another very popular Versace song. There's Bruno Mars's Versace on the Floor. There's also Migos, Versace, Versace, Versace. Versace has not done any kind of partnership with Migos because historically you see this kind of disconnect between hip hop and luxury. So even though it has a long-standing relationship, it has a long-standing cultural relationship, it does not necessarily have a business relationship between hip hop and luxury. And so as we kind of move into the stage of cultural capital and becoming more and more diverse from the perspective of being more accepting of other types of people, but us ourselves being several types of people, we will also have to see luxury being forced to be much more inclusive and be much more democratic and exposing themselves to certain kinds of audiences that they traditionally stayed away from. All right, so thank you. And I will open it up for questions. Does anybody has any questions? So that's a very good question. So Facebook has recently announced that they are going to change their algorithm so that they will start to deprioritize advertisements in people's feeds. What that will force companies to do is be much more creative. And so there are different types of advertising today. There's a different nature, especially on digital. So you see just blanket advertising. You also have native advertising that looks like it belongs there. And then you also have the influencer marketing world, which has an element of sponsorship and advertising to it. So what I think is going to happen is because of this change from Facebook's algorithm, that's going to force these luxury brands to be more and more creative. So they can no longer push themselves as this is me, Versace, as the brand, but it'll be somebody in your network already that represents the Versace brand and that you are more exposed to. That's a good question. Yeah, that definitely, it changes the rules of play. For advertising, yes, definitely. Facebook is definitely a pay-to-play platform now. When it first came out, that was not the case. But if you think about Facebook's data capability in terms of how much information they collect, not everybody is on Instagram, not everybody is on Snapchat, but almost everyone has Facebook, and not just here in the US, but at a global scale. So that's a massive amount of information. And we use different channels differently. So we use Pinterest, for example, to organize our thoughts, organize our plans. We use Twitter, for example, to talk about what's happening in real time, whether we're watching sports or whether we're watching something in politics or we're watching a TV show. We go there to have conversations and then we leave the platform. Most of us live on Facebook. And also remember that Facebook owns Instagram. So if you live on Instagram, they also own that too. And so so the platforms that we live on, the social platforms that we live on, are the ones that they have, which means they collect a massive amount of data, not just in terms of how you plan and how you prioritize your life or whether you're talking about a TV show, but they have absolutely everything. You go there to do absolutely everything and to engage with absolutely everyone. And I think Twitter, for example, you don't necessarily have the same types of connections because you can have conversations with somebody that you're not necessarily connected to. In Facebook, there is a solid connection between one person and another.
From my perspective. And so what are the ingredients to success from your perspective?
The ingredients to success. So I would definitely say that I think you have to believe in yourself first. I think that is first and foremost. So I've always kind of thought of, this is kind of the situation that I've thought of myself in throughout my career. If somebody has that job, that means that job is attainable. If it's attainable, that means I can get it. It's just a matter of how, right? And so whenever I hear somebody say like, oh, I could never be an actress, like that's just never gonna happen, I'm like, but somebody has that job, that's somebody's job. So it's possible. It's just a matter of pointing yourself in that direction and doing everything that you need to do to get there. So I think you first have to believe in yourself that you are capable of doing whatever you set yourself to accomplish. But I think you also have to be very stubborn about the goals that you have. And so when you set a goal, if it becomes difficult, change your route to get there, but do not change your goal. Change the journey to get there and figure out a different way. Yep.
Interest in fashion before you sort of exploring this world?
Yeah, so Luxe, I think, kind of came as a culmination of all of my experience. So I started in the art world, and I was looking for a way to still be creative, but in the business landscape. And so that kind of led me to marketing. And so because in marketing, there is never a black and white answer. Everything is, it depends, right? So when somebody says, should I do TV advertising? Well, that depends. How much money do you have? What target, what's your audience that you're trying to go after? What does your brand represent? What's your objective? And so you have a lot of opportunities to be creative, not just from the design perspective, but from a strategy perspective. And I think that that is huge. And so because I was doing a lot of marketing, it kind of led me, there was big kind of tech startup boom at that time. And so it led me into the world of doing marketing for tech companies. And so by the very nature of that, you can't talk about marketing without talking about technology now. And so you become so much more in tune with what's going on in the world of data, what's going on in terms of analytics and speaking that language, and speaking the language of coding because they're so closely related. And so I think it's kind of come as the culmination of all of my experience that I was starting to see what was going on in the fashion space specifically. So Luxe, we cover the luxury category, but we cover a bunch of different industries within that. And so we don't just focus on fashion, but we have a bunch of industries that we cover. But I think what was really interesting about the fashion space was that it was so behind from what was going on in tech. It was almost as if it didn't realize that data was available now, and that you can start making these decisions based on not, I like to kind of think of it as, instead of making decisions based on the opinion of the highest paid person in the room, you democratize decision making by the fact that decisions have to be made on data. So whether the highest paid person in the room or the person that has the most authority in the room doesn't have data to support their opinion, then it is an opinion. And so I think in the world of fashion, they are so behind when it comes to kind of accepting this into the way that they run their businesses, and that was really surprising to me. So I was talking with a trend forecasting company that focuses specifically on design in the fashion space, and they were presenting a report, and I was questioning their methodology, and there was almost no data or research to support the trend that they were presenting. And so I kind of saw that as a huge opportunity, the fact that there is almost not a whole lot of trend forecasting outside of the fashion space. And so kind of thinking about your business from the perspective of not why my customers are buying from me now, but why will they still buy from me 3 months from now, anywhere to 2 years from now, I think is a very important conversation to have in fashion and everywhere else, especially with the nature of business today and technology today. But I think being able to bring all those tech and data-driven skills to a world that has been very artistically driven, I think is a huge opportunity to kind of mix those worlds together. And luxury, we focus specifically on luxury because nobody is really addressing their needs. Luxury, you can't treat it the same way that you would any other company. And so they don't follow business best practices. They don't follow the normal rules of marketing. When you think of even when you think of traditional marketing models, they don't necessarily follow them. It doesn't apply to them. And so even if you are getting intelligence on what's working in terms of the marketing world or what's working in terms of business best practices, it rarely ever applies to the world of luxury. So for example, last year, giveaways started to become huge from a marketing perspective in terms of building email lists. A luxury brand can't do a giveaway. That's not something that they can do. So even though that's great insight for most of the marketplace, it's not applicable for luxury brands. Yes, this is my company. Yeah, we have a team. We have a team of about 10 people. Some of the team is based in New York, and some of them are based in Miami, actually, in South Florida. What do you mean? It was an idea, yeah. And I've had quite a lot of experience at this point building businesses. And so I was kind of in my own incubation stage. And so I was coming up with different business models and different business ideas. And then I would create the websites. I would poke a whole bunch of holes. I would poke a ton of holes into it. So I'd be like, okay, this would work in terms of a product. It's definitely going to fulfill the need, but the distribution portion of this is too hard. So then I would scratch that business idea and move on to a next one. And so it's like, okay, so I could do this idea, but then we would have to get a massive amount of funding just to even get this off the ground. Okay, let's scratch that idea. And so it was probably 3 months of kind of like incubating and running through different business ideas, running through different business models, and obviously like soaking up as much information as possible, so spending a whole lot of time in libraries, spending in old school libraries with the printed books, and spending a whole lot of time just having conversations with other people in this space and seeing what their challenges were. And ultimately, that became Luxe. So at first, it was just the idea, and even the name Luxe was actually tested based on data. It was chosen based on data. So we actually did an A/B test with Luxe and another name, and we tried to figure out which one people would click on the most, and Luxe won, and so that's what we named the company. So even down to what the company name was a data-driven decision. Yeah. Ooh. Excellent. Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for spending your evening with me.